Thank you all for joining us for the International Institute's Globally Engaged Career Panel. All of our panelists are graduates or were affiliates of University of Michigan's Area Studies programs and have gone on to pursue career paths with a global reach. So we hope that this will be helpful for all of you as you think about your future career paths.
And I want to say thanks so much to our panelists for making time across multiple time zones to share their experiences and expertise with us, and for adapting to this new virtual format. And thanks to you all as well for doing that. Thanks also to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the Masters in International and Regional Studies program for hosting today's event, and especially to Alanna Rodriguez for pulling this all together. Generous funding for this event comes from the following centers and programs: the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the MIRS program, the Kenneth G. Lieberthal and Richard H. Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, the Center for South Asian Studies, the NAM Center for Korean Studies, and the Center for Japanese Studies. And this event is funded in part by the Title VI National Resource Center grants from the U.S. Department of Education.
And to explain a bit of the order of things, we will begin by asking each panelist to introduce themselves to start the conversation. Then we'll ask a couple of questions that will be directed at all of the panelists, and then one question specifically for each panelist. As we're going along, we invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function on the right-hand side. We'll also ask those at the end as time allows. As a quick note, Lauren Cooper will be exiting the event a bit early, so if you have questions that you would like Lauren to address, please feel free to ask them, and we'll try to get them in before she leaves, or we can put you in contact after the event. So let's start by asking each of our panelists to quickly present themselves. And let us start with Sarah Brooks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah. I was at the University of Michigan from 2008 until 2011, at the Chinese Studies Center and at the Forum for Public Policy. In the interim, the embarrassingly long amount of time since then, I worked for 4 years in Washington, D.C., and since spring of 2015 have been working in Geneva, Switzerland, in a human rights NGO.
Thank you, Sarah. And Lauren Cooper?
Hi, everyone. I think I'm coming in now. Nice to meet you all. My name is Lauren Cooper. I'm delighted to be here today. I was at University of Michigan for graduate school from 2009 to 2012. I was in the School of Natural Resources and Environment, and I also earned a Master's of Urban Planning, so an emphasis on natural resource policy and planning kind of across the board. I was also affiliated with the Latin American and Caribbean Studies program. I earned a FLAS and studied Quechua in Peru and also back in the academic year at the University of Michigan. Since my time at U of M, I moved to DC as well for a year. Afterwards, I worked at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, but really felt drawn to Latin America and pushed hard from there to find a position in Peru. And I lived in Peru for a few years. And since that time, I've been back in Michigan, and I work now, I direct the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University in the Forestry Department.
Thank you, Lauren. And Jessica Hill-Riggs.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Hill-Riggs, and I am an academic program specialist at the University of Michigan Center for Southeast Asian Studies, where I engage in research and grant administration. And I also work part-time as a LEO lecturer for the program in International and Comparative Studies, as well as the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And I graduated with a dual master's degree in Southeast Asian Studies and Public Policy from the University of Michigan in 2015. And I also hold a bachelor's degree in comparative religion from the College of Worcester. So since I graduated in 2015, I went directly to working at the University of Michigan in a part-time capacity and then a full-time capacity. And I'm excited to speak to you all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And Benjamin Sweeney.
I graduated from the Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies MA MPP dual degree program offered with the Ford School. After graduation, I moved to Washington, D.C. to work in international development, focusing on Eastern Europe focusing on Eastern Europe and Eurasia, primarily on USAID-funded projects, including at Eurasia Foundation, IRG Agility, and then Chemonics International. I currently work at the Federal Voting Assistance Program, or FVAP, which assists overseas U.S. citizens, military service members, and their families with absentee voting. And so if and when you're a U.S. citizen abroad and want to vote, please visit our website at fvap.gov for more info, or talk to me afterwards.
Thank you, Benjamin. So let's go ahead and get started with our questions. So let's start with navigating changing career paths. It's very common nowadays for professionally successful individuals to have many different jobs over the course of their career. Can you each tell us a little bit about your professional trajectory, how your humanities or social science background led you into the professional world, and how you navigated transitions from there? Did you start out with a clear idea of what you wanted to do? How did that idea change over time? And if you don't mind, we'll start with you, Benjamin.
Good question. I actually had to think about this one a little bit. I did not necessarily have a career path like exactly focused on, but knew I did want to work in Eastern Europe since undergrad, but wasn't exactly sure how. I had a Fulbright right after undergrad, and during that got interested in working in international development, which is what led me to then get the degree in public policy to supplement the area studies degrees, and then worked at the development companies after graduating. And then while working for these international development companies and on these projects, I built up a number of project management skills, which led me to where I am now. International development isn't always the most, well-paying or stable job. And where I currently am still has a pretty big international focus and lets me use a lot of my international skills as well as project management skills, which is how I got here. So I guess one thing to say is, though, it's okay to not know exactly what you want to do and that you will have developing interests and developing skills as you gain more experiences along the way.
I'm sure that'll put a lot of students at ease.
I hope so.
Thank you. Can we go ahead and turn to Lauren?
Sure. I had to think about this a little bit as well. When I look back, it's interesting. Now that I look back at my path, I see there's a lot of similarity. There's a thread going through my work. But when you're going through the process, you don't necessarily feel that that you don't necessarily, at least in my case, I didn't necessarily know where I was going. I've always been passionate about environmental issues, but figuring out how to interact with those was challenging and exactly what was most interesting to me. And even when I was in graduate school, I felt like I could come out of here and be like a wetlands restoration specialist, or I could be like an urban planner, or I could do forestry. So it felt still very wide open, even in grad school. And so, I think I guess, my big takeaway was that you're going to continue to learn, and your work experience and internship experiences all feed into this development of your ideas of what you like to be working on and the environment you like to work in and what makes you feel productive and impactful in the world in a way that's fulfilling to you. And so, it's not going to be everything. You're not going to get everything from graduate school or from undergrad, but they all kind of feed into each other, and being aware as you're going through the process of different internships or trying out positions, being aware of like what you like about something and what you don't like very much about it, or I really like this, but I never get to be in the field, or I never get to interact with policymakers, or something that is maybe missing for you. Be aware of that, because you're always going to have opportunities as you go forward to keep exploring. And when I look back at my path, I see that I've done a range of things. I worked in inner city environmental issues, environmental justice and recycling in inner city Detroit, and I worked in the jungles of the Amazon. But there's a lot of similarities, and over time I've gotten more comfortable with knowing what I like to work on and what makes me feel fulfilled in my work.
Thank you, Lauren. And Sarah, if you could give us your comments.
Sure. So when I left the University of Michigan, I had no real idea what I was getting myself into, and was sort of had a blank slate ahead of me. But it turns out a few years ago, when my parents were packing up the house that I grew up in, I found a senior yearbook. And in one of the interviews in the senior yearbook, apparently, I had already decided that I was going to work in human rights and international relations, and maybe at the UN. So funny enough, I'd forgotten that, and yet find myself now very much in the position that the 18-year-old me wanted to be. So half a lifetime later, I think that's kind of a nice thing to discover. But I would agree with Lauren that the process of getting here was neither clear nor particularly in some cases well thought out. But it relied very much on a combination, I think, of having a strong skills base, of having the willingness to kind of put myself out there and to be uncomfortable in new positions or trying new things, even within an organization. I mentioned that I'd worked in DC and I worked for the State Department. So I had joined them as a presidential management fellow. So my first job out of grad school was in a gigantic bureaucracy. Leaving that was a hard decision for many reasons, but one thing that was not hard was switching into a very, very small bureaucracy. My current organization, when I joined, was 15 people globally, and now is about 22. So I kind of found myself adapting to a very new situation, but I think at the same time, really learning how to apply a lot of the skills and a lot of the getting over discomfort that you gain in the first few years of a job to the current position that I'm in. The idea of how involved I want to be in policy making has also changed. And one of the things that I really value about my job now is that I have the chance on some days to walk into the European Parliament and do a hearing with the Human Rights Subcommittee. And on other days, I get to be in a small conference room of a tiny NGO somewhere in Asia. So that's pretty cool.
And Jessica, what can you tell our audience?
Sure. So I think, my professional story really began as an undergraduate at the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio, where I studied comparative religion and history. And I had the opportunity to live and conduct research in Thailand for about a year, where I focused on Buddhism, gender, and identity in relationship to the sex industry in Southeast Asia. And while in Thailand, I met just an amazing group of Thai and American educators and professionals, and developed mentors who really supported me in meeting my research and professional and personal goals. And I feel like that's where I really just, fell in love with Thai and Southeast Asian culture and the people and qualitative research. And that's sort of where my lifelong engagement in the region began. Looking back, I graduated from undergrad during the last recession in 2007, which may be a concern for many of you today, given our current reality. And it was difficult to find jobs. And so I knew that I had wanted to go back to graduate school, but not right away. And so I applied to do an AmeriCorps Vista program in Boston. So Volunteers in Service to America. And there in Boston, I did a lot of outreach work, grant writing, community organizing, and building about poverty prevention and educational access. So this was a path that was very, different from my interests in international studies and Southeast Asian studies, but it was a really an amazing time in terms of professional development and skill building for me. But sort of as Lauren mentioned, I felt like there was, looking back now, I see this thread and this, interest in Southeast Asian studies continued to remain and was sort of like knocking at the door. Which led me to go back to the University of Michigan and study Thai language and culture and public policy. Once I graduated, I ended up staying in Michigan for family reasons. And so was looking for alternative work and ended up doing, working part-time on a research project called the ICLAS Research Initiative, which focused on Islam and community building with Muslims of Metro Detroit. And so looking back, like many of my other colleagues here speaking, I didn't have a clear sense of what I wanted to do, but I had a really strong interest in sort of religion and interfaith dialogue and public focused engagement. And so that thread is interestingly there, throughout my trajectory. But I feel like in terms of navigating those transitions and sort of figuring out that path, I really heavily relied on reaching out to my mentors. So faculty through school and other personal mentors who maybe were able, to see the things in that thread that I wasn't currently able to see. So I think for me, part of my story is really developing those personal relationships with faculty and other mentors who could help coach me along my path. And I think that was sort of what led me to work professionally at U of M post-graduation.
Thank you. And thank you all for your answers.
Thanks, Erin. And thank you all. Those were really wonderful responses. So I want to turn to addressing the current reality that we are all living in. We recognize that many students and professionals, as Jess talked about, are feeling tremendous anxiety both personally and professionally during the current global pandemic that we're living through. So I wonder if each of you could talk a bit about how your work is being affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and what changes or shifts you've made to adapt, maybe what skills are particularly useful in this moment. Additionally, many students and other job seekers may find themselves with some extra or unwanted time on their hands during this crisis. So maybe what are some ways that job seekers can leverage that extra time right now to gain skills that they can maybe add to their resumes, or otherwise take proactive steps to get involved in professional development in this moment. Sarah, do you mind if we start with you?
Not at all. So I'm in a very interesting position. A lot of the work that I do happens sort of in advocacy in spaces like the UN, where in-person meetings are really important. But there's also a lot of work that goes into preparing for that goes into engaging with NGOs and activists in the area of capacity building. So sort of knowledge, skills building, and accompaniment, helping them think through strategically, if they have an objective that they want to change a law or to to get justice for a human rights violation, how can the UN help them do that? And so it's been interesting that some of my work has continued almost without change. A lot of things that can cover multiple time zones, multiple languages, and where it's easy to shift to a remote work because it's really what we were doing already. The other part of the work, though, and I think the part that's really about kind of getting on the ground and having the one-on-one meetings, we have seen that that's been a little bit more difficult to kind of wrap our heads around. So as an institution, our organization is doing a lot to try and document what are the good practices that we see governments or other NGOs or international organizations taking that help make sure that civil society or activists or academics or the general public can still follow what's happening. If you can't go to the meeting, what else can you do using technology? But we're also trying to push them and trying to say, there's a lot that will happen now as institutions like the European Commission or the UN Human Rights Council are changing their way of working that maybe risk actually excluding voices more than they include. And so what's been interesting is that while the COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on how we work, it's also having an impact on the kinds of advocacy discussions that we conduct. In terms of skills, I think what's really an important skill in making sure that you don't shift entirely, at least from our perspective, the focus of our work is thinking about framing and thinking about how to talk about the issues that are important to us now, that were important to us a month ago, that will be important 3 months down the road, but be able to talk about those with an awareness that there's very little bandwidth, maybe for policymakers or for media, but also there are ways that it connects to other discussions about COVID-19. So just by way of example, one of the things we've worked quite a bit on is the protection of space for NGOs and other charitable organizations to organize and be active, which was already a challenge in a lot of parts of Europe. But the Hungarian government passed a law last week that basically allows the president endless emergency powers. And so all of the challenges that some of our partners were facing already are even worse. It means we can still talk about those issues, talk about restrictions on NGO registration or on funding, but we can link it to COVID-19 and make it relevant for our policy audience. So I think that's really important. And just to wrap up, I really struggled because I think a lot of our colleagues and a lot of the interns that we've had or some of our academic partners are also thinking, what else can we do? How can we use the time that we have because we're working remotely? And one thing that I found is really useful is to actually use it to observe. I'm sure a lot of us are spending way too much time on social media, but when you're on social media, in addition to consuming information, think about how the communication is being done effectively. What are the challenges, especially if you're following particular organizations, Amnesty USA, for example? What are the things they're doing that are really effective? And how can you sort of understand that as a communication skill? Same thing for editorials. So really trying to, as you're taking in information, be thinking about it not simply as informing yourself, but also being able to structure what can you learn from it.
That's really insightful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Lauren, do you mind weighing in next?
Sure. So my day job has not necessarily been impacted that much. So my work in the Forest Carbon and Climate program, we actually already operate in a largely digital space. We have professional development short courses that are completely online, and we've actually been kind of cutting edge in that way that there's a lot of forestry training that doesn't actually work like that. And we're the first program globally that focuses on carbon and climate topics with forestry. And we already reach an international audience. So a lot of our, I have colleagues who have been scrambling to move their courses online very quickly, but we were already operating in that space. And I do a monthly webinar series. So a lot of my normal activities have been able to continue pretty normally. And if anything, we've seen our participation kind of shoot up in some things because no one's traveling, everyone's home. So it's been nice to be able to continue to meet the needs of learners that have been, like we qualify for continuing education credits for different certification bodies, and basically all summer trainings have been canceled. In-person trainings in pretty much across the United States already are starting to be canceled. So that is continuing, but I still do work in Peru. I do international research, and that's an area of growth for our program. We already have a lot of international folks participating in our training, but I'd like to, going forward, create content that's more tailored to international audiences and also available in additional languages like French and Spanish, to be able to bring in more professionals and technicians that are in our heavily forested countries around the world. And that work in theory can still continue, but my field work in Peru, I was actually supposed to be in Peru like last week. That obviously is not happening. And so there are big question marks. We were also supposed to fly up some collaborators. We got a grant from our university to fly up some collaborators from Peru for a summer workshop on forestry and gender that we were putting on. So that's been slowed down. So I think a lot of it's just getting a little more flexible, thinking about, well, what can we do remotely? We want to keep the momentum. We don't necessarily have to be in person for some of that. So rethinking what we'd like to do and putting some things on hold or pushing back a little bit. But to continue to advance my work in Peru, something that is challenging sometimes is that there can be major cultural differences in how people work and communicate. And I found that in Latin America to be the case, that you get a lot done if you show up on the ground and you're actually like, hi, I'm going to be at your office tomorrow afternoon. That suddenly you'll get a response and people are very responsive. That can be challenging with email. Some culturally are just not as responsive to emails. We have a huge email culture in the United States and other places, so which there's just not the same culture around email. And so that was a concern at first, and there's certainly going to be some people that I'm not going to be able to get in touch with. But there are people that I can, and there are people that are really responsive, like the two colleagues I mentioned that we were gonna fly up this summer. They're extremely responsive. I'm texting with people on WhatsApp, which is, people are super responsive on WhatsApp in Latin America. So sometimes it's thinking differently about how you might communicate and using the modes of communication that people are more comfortable with in the global context. And then relying on the people that you do have great relationships with that are really responsive. So if you're looking for networking opportunities, or you have a trip that got canceled this summer, I would encourage you to not feel too slowed down by it. There are people that will be responsive to you. Keep poking around until you can find them. Ask them for an informational interview. Use Skype, and still go forward. You can make great relationships and keep it going forward, but being a little bit aware that you might not do things the same way, but there's certainly a path to move forward in your work.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I personally find that extremely helpful for my summer plans. And WhatsApp is also very common in the Middle East. So thank you very much. Jess, would you mind going next?
Sure. So I feel like a lot of my experiences are very similar to Sarah and Lauren's. I definitely have aspects of my job that have stayed the same. So I manage a $2.5 million budget from the federal government. I'm still engaging in, drafting biannual grant reports, and engaging in sort of short-term and long-term strategic planning and program evaluation. But I think what has been challenging is a lot of the programmatic initiatives that I work on have had to be canceled or sort of reformatted or, postponed to a later date. And so in some ways, my job has stayed the same, but then everything has sort of come to a halt and sort of had to recalibrate and adapt and be flexible. I also was hoping to lead a trip for educators to Thailand and Vietnam this summer, which will most likely not happen. And so I definitely see across my colleagues who support students, faculty, and community members on a college campus the sense of grief, that our projects are being halted, and that we've had to dismantle a lot of things. And so at this time, what skills are particularly useful? I think, having flexibility in your job, compassion, and a sense of humor, knowing that we're living in a very unique time. And in terms of thinking about students who are, on the job market or trying to sharpen, their resume or may have extra time, I would really recommend to take this time to volunteer with an organization of your interest, whether by serving on a board or helping out in whatever capacity you can remotely. So I think in my final year of graduate school, I worked with a Cambodian nonprofit and wrote grants from them remotely. As Lauren suggested, take this time to do informational interviews, reach out to people you admire in your field. You'd be surprised at how many people are willing to just check in for 15 minutes and share their career path with you. And also sort of what Sarah mentioned, take this time to keep alert to the topics and trends taking place in your region of interest by following news sources, academic sources, or blogs daily or weekly. And I would definitely, recommend brush up on your writing skills, not just academic or research writing, but thinking about different forms of writing for different stakeholders, such as memos, blogs, or grant writing. I think those are ways that you can, use this time to be proactive and sort of engage in professional development.
Thank you so much, Beth. And finally, Ben.
I want to echo what basically almost everything people have said before me, which is, so most of my office functions are fairly normal, and we're all able to transition to working remotely. We've canceled all of our travel though, and are looking at how to conduct workshops remotely as opposed to in person and postpone them. We're also facing a lot of challenges with postal systems and with the election systems generally, and it's pretty hard to run absentee voting in a situation like this. And as a number of other people mentioned, one real key seems to be flexibility, as is communication. So being ready for fast changing circumstances as you find out what they are, and just figuring out what they are to the extent you can, but not freaking out to the detriment of just continuing and going on. Now it's a great time to really just dive into researching the professional field you're interested in, as other people like Jessica mentioned. One thing to do is you could map different organizations and how they're linked to each other, read their publications, follow their social media. They're kind of endless wormholes you can go down. And then networking informally, doing informational interviews. Now is a really great time for that. I'm sure there are plenty of receptive people who are looking to break up their daily routine. And people are generally very happy to share tips with people who were in their shoes 15 years ago, something like that. One other thing I'll share is I applied to a job like a year ago, something like that, and someone from that organization reached out to me like a few days ago. Like, there still are places that are hiring. They said that the interview process would be completely remote. If any of my colleagues are watching this, I'm definitely not applying for it. But it was heartening to know that that is a possibility for people. And then there's also lots of work that can be done remotely anyways, including writing, editing, translation, proposal work, grants writing. And I think just put yourself out there is what I would say.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks to all of you. Those were such insightful responses, and I think I know I will, but also I think our students will really benefit from some of the things you said. just since Lauren has to hop off early, I think we're going to go ahead and ask her a question specific to her experience, then we'll go back to our last general question. So Lauren, you received both the academic year and summer FLAS fellowship to study Quechua during your master's program, excuse me, in environmental planning at U of M. So why should students outside of area studies programs consider applying to FLAS, and how did that fit into your degree? And then if you could talk a little bit about what role, if any, your language experience has played in your career since then.
Okay, yeah, so thanks for being flexible, everyone, and letting me jump in with this question. Oh, so Quechua is such a wonderful language. This opportunity was like amazing for me on so many levels. Learning language in general is wonderful, like a wonderful experience. And I was also instructed like 100% in Spanish, because nobody that I've come across that's teaching Quechua also is fluent in English. So it was like double translation. So first of all, it really helped me boost my Spanish skills, because I was trying to really understand another language through another language. But it really opened up a part of the world to me. I had already been obsessed with Peru, but when I was applying to study Quechua, and I was eager to find ways to get back. So, you know, this is, if you're a student and you know you have like a draw to a part of the world, just keep poking around, finding ways to get back there or get linkages to it on your CV. So this was kind of part of it for me. And it was just this wonderful window into a whole nother way of communicating and thinking about the world. You know, it's not like a Latin-based language. It was very difficult to learn. But it really boosted my Spanish skills at the same time. It gave me an opportunity to spend time in Peru. And since then, you know, like I said earlier, looking back, there's a lot of connections that you know, I think sometimes maybe to an outsider viewing your life, that seems like you're doing random things, but to you, you're interested in stuff. So you keep kind of trying things and doing things and trying activities because they're connected for you in some ways. And it's interesting. I just last Friday submitted with some new collaborators in Highland, Peru, where I haven't actually worked. I only went and studied Quechua in the Andean region, but then I've been working in forest conservation in the Amazon basin since then. I got a new connection and this relationship started, and I was invited to jump on a proposal in Highland Quechua-speaking communities looking at community forest management, which is also related to like a project I got on with the World Bank looking at community forest management in Mexico a couple of years ago and published a paper on it. So it's like the more you go further along you get in your career, the more you're like, oh, there's actually connections here and these things overlap and I have some experience with this. So it has actually played a big role, and I think it actually had a huge influence in getting me into the position that brought me to Peru when I lived there for 2 years. So being able to really show like I've been, you know, committed to learning about this part of the world and moving, you know, beyond just like I want to move somewhere else because it sounds fun. It was like I've actually dedicated time to learning the culture, learning language. I'm interested in the land use issues in this part of the world. And it ultimately, I think, was very helpful in me securing the position that I had in Peru when I moved down there. So I would strongly recommend that to anyone. And that would be also to go back to the other question. If you have some downtime, which I'm at a point now where I don't have downtime ever because I have 2 small children, but I would love to work on my language skills. If you have downtime, work on your language skills. There's excellent resources out there, and always maps and stats. Those are the things that always will keep coming up. If you have skills in maps, stats, and language, I feel like they keep coming around. But language was huge for opening up doors for me, and I'm setting my sights on Portuguese next. But a lot of it started with this class for me.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for sharing some time out of your busy schedule with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I will throw it back to Erin now for the next general question.
Sure. So I think that a lot of students are interested in how to deal with potential setbacks and how you think through this process as you're moving through a career or career trajectory. So if you could each just explain one major obstacle to the degree that you're comfortable, either in your personal life or professional field, that you've had to overcome in order to achieve the professional success that you enjoy today. So how did you handle it? And more importantly, how has that shaped your career and your outlook? And if we could start with Lauren, real quick.
Sure, and I'd love to answer this. So I guess when I think about like kind of the biggest challenge, just to be like more on just the personal side of my response here, I'm the first to go to college in my immediate family. So I pretty quickly got to where I didn't I didn't have a lot of support around me as I was like starting to move forward. I mean, my parents didn't go to college at all. So even getting through undergrad, but then once I was in grad school, I couldn't really, I felt very quickly like, wow, I'm kind of out of my league here. I'm from inner city Detroit. I remember when I started at University of Michigan that I was like, I'm not sure if I fit in here. And then, those experiences kind of kept coming too when I first started my first position in DC, feeling like walking in the room and feeling pretty intimidated. And so I would, and I don't, I don't know if everyone experiences that to that degree, but it's been awesome looking back and seeing that I don't feel like that anymore, and that it's kind of a choice to decide that you belong in the room. And so I think that if I had known that earlier and at a younger age, decide you belong in the room. There's no reason that you don't belong in any room. And so feeling like if you can get cool opportunities and you're not 100% sure if you can rise to the occasion, or maybe you can rise to the occasion, but then you get intimidated when you get in there. It's like you have to tell yourself, I belong in this room. And even if it's intimidating, it's okay. So I would just put that out there, that I think everyone probably struggles with that at different points. But that's something that has certainly been really powerful for me to overcome. And then the other big thing is, I would say I've applied to so many grants and so many things, and I do not get all of them. And you just keep applying to things. So job opportunities, fellowships, grants, you just keep applying. I almost don't even, I put in the thing and I don't even almost think about it anymore. If I get it, great. If I don't, it's already kind of in the past. I'm moving on to the next thing. So I would say be proactive about applying to lots of stuff and don't let things get you down. A lot of things feed into each other. So even going through the process of writing a proposal or getting a grant or making those relationships, even if it isn't funded, is still valuable and actually moving you forward, even if you don't know quite how yet. So that's fun. That's my 2 cents on that.
I imagine that'll resonate with a lot of our students. Thank you for sharing. And thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Take care.
Bye. Benjamin, do you mind jumping in?
Sure. So similar to what Lauren said, I really recommend applying to lots of things, grants, jobs, fellowships. And as you go along doing that, refine your application language and refine your interests. But really what is it? You can't get it if you don't apply for it. So this is going to date myself, but I graduated from undergraduate and was meant to head out on a Fulbright fellowship in the summer of 2008, and was meant to head to Republic of Georgia, but there was an armed conflict with Russia at the time, and so the Fulbright was postponed indefinitely. So was just out of undergrad and had no real backup plans, and was already traveling and was planning on traveling to Georgia from Russia, which got canceled. And so this was pretty stressful. And again, with this, I mentioned before, flexibility being key. And so I looked into what other options were available and sort of mapped out all those options, what I could potentially do, which I think included a Fulbright in a different country, canceling the Fulbright and applying again later, or just waiting it out. And I ended up traveling a little bit more and doing research, and was eventually able to go to Georgia. And by the time I got there, the situation on the ground had changed so much from from what I had written in my proposal of what I was going to study. And and ended up getting a lot more out of the experience because of this, because I got to tailor my research and work to what was happening there, and worked with Transparency International, focusing on monitoring the international aid response, and got to look at the international aid system sort of from a higher view, but also looking at crisis response and internally displaced people. And this really honed my interest in international development and sort of gave me a path forward for what I knew I wanted to study in the future. So look for the bright side, try to make, not to be trite, but make lemonade out of the lemons life hands you. And apply to lots of things. Going back to that.
Thank you, Ben. I think there are a lot of students that are kind of in a similar situation right now with the COVID-19 climate. So I appreciate your comments. How about we move over to Sarah real quick?
Sure. So just to weigh in on the Fulbright question, I also received a Fulbright 2007 then, immediately after undergrad, and I did take it and I did go. And looking back, while it was incredibly powerful, I was in China, in Hangzhou, which is about an hour and a half of a fast train inland from Shanghai. I think I would have gotten so much more out of it had it been inadvertently postponed, had I had the time to really focus on why I was doing that beyond I need something to do after graduation. So, in retrospect, while it was incredibly important for me, I think in terms of long-term investment, and also the kind of short-term, really getting as much out of it as I could have, having a delay, intentional or not, would have been really, really helpful. The obstacle that I wanted to talk about is also related maybe a little bit to a separate question, but one that came up on the Q&A. I am not a lawyer, and yet I work in international human rights law. So I put this up as an obstacle because it seems like a really big one, particularly when you're looking at applying to positions overseas, entry-level academic positions, I mean, you name it. There's a very clear alignment between area of study and job description. And in the US, particularly coming from an area studies background, you really don't have that. And so for a long time, and despite all of the best efforts of Susan Waltz at the Ford School, I still, I think, had a little bit of a worry that to do human rights work, you did need a legal background. But I've learned over time, first of all, that that means very different things in different places. So a legal education in the US is very different from what it is in the UK or here on continental Europe. The kinds of ways you use a legal education also very different. And so I think I'm putting it in the obstacle that I thought was an obstacle, but actually it turns out just meant that I look at things a little bit differently. And sometimes I do have to put in more work, and I do have to think through much more carefully the arguments that I want to make. But on the other hand, I think it's actually a welcome perspective in many cases to have a non-lawyer in the room. It helps me sometimes to ground the issues of broader structural challenges, particularly around human rights. It helps to ground some of the personal elements of working with victims of violations. So I think that's one thing that I kind of want to put up there, which is half an answer to the question. But I think becoming comfortable with not being a lawyer in human rights spaces, actually, Lauren put it really well. You still deserve to be in the room without having that law degree in your pocket.
Thank you very much. I imagine We have quite a few students that are in the audience right now that are interested in areas very close to your work. So all of your feedback, I think, will be very helpful. And can we go ahead and move to Jessica?
Sure. So I would say, everything that Sarah, Lauren, and Benjamin have shared really resonates strongly with me. But I think I will share more of a personal challenge, and I guess I would not refer to it as an obstacle per se, but more of a challenge or a detour. And so when I graduated from grad school, my father became very ill. And for that reason, I decided to stay in Michigan to be closer to family instead of pursuing a job internationally or moving to Washington, D.C., which is what I originally thought that I was going to do. And so I think it's just, important to acknowledge that sometimes we have, family responsibilities, elder care, or your partner or spouse's career might, take off in a different direction. And because these decisions pop up in different seasons of your life that cause you to choose a different path than originally planned. And so I think from that experience, that really taught me to be flexible, to be open to new possibilities, and try to find work that you find meaningful. And I think there's this tendency, as an undergrad or a graduate student, you say like, oh, I'm a Southeast Asianist, or, oh, I focus on human rights. There's this tendency to name, this is what I'm into. And in reality, we're constantly growing. Our interests are, changing all the time. And so just to open yourself up to your career taking you to a new direction. I think that's really important to keep that sort of mindset. And also just to echo, what Lauren was saying, I've now had the opportunity in my career to be on several hiring committees. And I wish that I had known, as I was interviewing for jobs in the past, that like when you get an interview, it basically means that the committee feels like you can do the job. They're interviewing you because they know that you can do the job. You have the skills and the experience to do so. And it's really more about finding the right fit for the organization. And so if you get rejections, if you don't get the job, just continue to be positive, continue to apply. There are so many other factors that sort of, go into hiring and finding if something is a mutual fit for an organization or a company. But really maintain that positivity, know that you deserve to be there, that you're on the right path, and keep that positive outlook. That has been, I wish I had known that in the earlier part of my career. But that's what I encourage you all to do.
And thank you for your words of encouragement.
Yes.
If we can go ahead and bounce back, I know that you already talked about this a little bit, Sarah, but I'm going to ask in a slightly different way, so hopefully this is still fine. You have such an interesting history of human rights and humanitarian work, and we have so many students that are interested in this field. So could you talk about how your master's in public policy or any specific skills or experience that you gained at U of M assisted you in finding work in the field? And then based on that, this is kind of what I'd like to focus on, is what advice you might give students that are maybe in a very similar position. So anything that sounds useful or helpful, please speak to it.
Sure. So very practically, I think the support from Michigan overall, and specifically from the Ford School through the career services, was incredibly valuable. And I know it seems like a bunch of extra work or a lot of emails, but I truly think that the investment they made in the whole cohort of Ford School students my year who were applying to be part of the Presidential Management Fellows program really did pay off. And for those of you who don't know, this is a At the time, it's changed slightly in the years since, but it was a way for students graduating from master's programs to go fast-tracked into civil service positions. So this covered all of the US federal agencies. Myself, I was interested in international work and ended up primarily interviewing with the State Department and then finally being placed there. But I don't think that any of that would have happened. There's several stages to the interviews that we had to go through, and the career services people were there every step of the way. So listen to them, love them, trust them, and I think it really will pay back. The second thing I wanted to highlight, though, which is more about skills, in both of my positions, no matter how different they were, so one working in the State Department's human rights team, one very small cog in a very big bureaucracy, and one position now, incredibly independent in a very small human rights NGO. There have been two things that have been really important. The first of that was having language skills and cultural knowledge and awareness that was relevant at the time. So when I applied for my position at the State Department, I was applying to a position in an office that focused on labor rights and supply chains. I was a Chinese speaker who had worked with Professor Mary Gallagher, and it was the same year that there was a slew of worker suicides in Apple iPhone factories. So this was on the agenda. People were interested. People wanted to hire somebody who had their sense of what was going on. When I was hired for ISHR, same thing. There had recently been a shift in Chinese government policy and investment in Chinese government engagement at the UN. And they said, look, we have a lot of things we need to do as a small organization, but we really need somebody on staff who understands and who can speak the language and who can kind of get a sense of how is this going to impact our work. So language skills and being able to connect that to the right place and the right time. The second thing that I think really came from U of M and the Ford School was writing skills. And I think, Jessica, you mentioned this earlier, but one of the first things I've been told by 3 bosses now is, wow, you're a really good writer. And it seems very simple, but I think given how much we rely on communication, whether that's internally in negotiations within our own office or externally to partners, the idea of needing to write clearly and compellingly is really important. And I think an undervalued skill sometimes. So I think kind of investing in that and suffering through what are inevitably very difficult sessions and going through different drafts, but really thinking about how to improve your writing in a range of areas, policy relevant, but also thinking about op-ed if you want to work in a communications field. I think it really does pay off, and my experience at Michigan, it really gave me a good base for that, and I use it all the time. So.
Thank you. You're making me feel like I should be writing more. And Catherine, I'll go ahead and give the floor back to you.
Thanks, Aaron. So Ben, our next question is for you, if you don't mind. So since graduating from your dual masters in public policy and Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, all of your work has been very internationally focused, particularly on Eurasia, but it's also been primarily based in the United States. So while some students pursuing international studies definitely aim to be living and working in their area of study, I think many are also looking for ways to work on international issues while living in the US. Particularly like what Jess was talking about, taking into account, like family, partner, other issues that you have to take into consideration when looking for a job. So what advice do you have for this latter group of students who want to work on international issues while living in the US?
So yeah, as Jessica was saying, there are plenty of reasons why you'd want to work internationally while living in the United States and sort of use international skills, but there are plenty of ways of doing that while being based here. Um, the work I was doing, much of it was about 90% domestic with some international travel. And it was is focusing on project management. Um, as Sarah was saying as well, writing skills really help with this. Doing proposal writing for grants, for other projects. There are a number of different organizations that allow you to do jobs like this, including federal government work. There's a lot of that that's based in the United States but does have an international focus. There are a lot of NGOs and international development companies that do the same thing. One thing that's also really worth looking into is in international development, in working for the federal government, there's the ability to do field assignments, either short or longer term. So you can generally be based in the United States, but travel a week a year, 2 weeks a year, go out for 6 months, go out for 2 years, but still have a base in the United States and have that flexibility. And that's something people should also consider, is not just seeing it as black and white, either just international or just domestic, but the possibility of some kind of combination of that. I had lived abroad for a while and hope to at some point again in the future, but really felt like it was time to live and stay in the United States for a while, but really, really, really appreciated the chance to travel a few times a year for a week or two each time. And that is a feel pretty good about that for now. And just want to encourage people to understand their options, that you can do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. And I'll pass it back to Erin.
Okay, so Jess, we have a lot of students that are interested in higher ed and international education. So could you describe some non-faculty opportunities and what those might look like based on your experience? So how might an internationally minded student apply their language and research experience and expertise in this area of work?
Thank you for that question, Erin. So there are definitely non-faculty opportunities for professionals wanting to apply their interest in international studies within higher education, especially if you know where to look. So in my current role, I am managing a federal grant, so I am overseeing a very large budget. I'm drafting grant reports. I'm designing and collecting performance measures. I'm doing a lot of long-term strategic planning. And through this work, I also have the opportunity to travel internationally and to develop research partnerships with faculty and other community stakeholders. And so I think, within higher ed, research and grant administration is definitely a pathway that you can take. And in particular, my training in area studies as a field, Southeast Asian studies in particular, my training as a FLAS fellow in Thai language and Indonesian language is directly relevant to the work that I do. So I work with the director of Southeast Asian Studies to bring scholars over from Southeast Asia. We plan conferences and lecture series, convenings for research initiatives, and I provide a lot of professional development support to different stakeholders on campus. And so my knowledge of the region, my language training, understanding the pressing issues in the different countries in Southeast Asia really sort of are extremely important in being aware and, bringing scholars and addressing hot topic issues on campus. But I also really heavily rely on my training from the policy school. So I engage in a lot of grant writing, budgeting, project management, those intercultural awareness skills, language skills, learning how to build consensus across different stakeholders and community organizations. But I also work with a whole slew of international educators across the university. So I have an amazing group of colleagues who serve in academic advising and counseling capacities, folks who do communications-based work, others who work on fellowships and cultivating internships internationally, crafting research opportunities for faculty and students. And so with my colleagues who are working in these sectors, all of them have a background in area studies, international education, or they have lived over in those countries in which they're developing relationships with, so previously. And so that language training is directly relevant to the work that we do and developing relationships with partners globally. So I feel like there are a lot of other non-faculty opportunities. And it's just sort of finding, what are you most passionate and excited about? Are you, wanting to see yourself in communications? Would you want to do research and grant administration? Or would you love to, develop internships for students, both undergrad and graduate, to go to China? All of these skills and these opportunities are ways that you could utilize your international education training.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for answering our questions up until now. We're at the portion where we're going to switch into Q&A. So we've been taking all of your questions thus far. If you think of anything else as audience members, please post those in the Q&A section on the side. And we'll go ahead and give the floor to Alanna. So she's going to be fielding your questions.
Hi, everyone. Am I on? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, great, thanks. So kind of appearing out of nowhere, my name is Alanna Rodriguez. I'm the program manager at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of Michigan. So I work very closely with our panelist, Jessica, and I've been working with Catherine Downs and Aaron Hoover on this event for the past few months, and I just really want to thank them and also properly introduce them. They are current students in the International Institute's Masters in International and Regional Studies program, and they played just such a huge role in organizing this event, and I wanted to kind of point out that getting involved on campus in the way that they have is just a really great form of professional development. So I encourage all of the students watching to, look out for campus jobs and just networking with your advisors and the people that you work with. You never know what could lead to, a future career opportunity. So with that said, if you haven't already submitted a question on the bottom right portion of your screen, if you're on a computer or if you're on a mobile device, just look for that Q&A button. Please do. I've got a couple questions already, so thank you so much for engaging. I'm going to start with this one. Some of us undergraduates, namely juniors, may never have been abroad as undergraduates, and due to COVID-19, may no longer be able to go abroad before we graduate. How can we stay globally engaged after graduating? What postgraduate abroad opportunities should we look for? And so Ben kind of touched upon, working internationally while being based in the US, but this question kind of asks more about, well, what do we do without any previous international experience? So I'm going to let Ben start us off, and then we'll go to Sarah and Jess.
Thank you. That's a good question. And it's a little bit, I don't know, adds an extra wrinkle to it. I think touching back on a number of things we've discussed include brushing up on your writing skills, offering yourself out as a grant writer or proofreader or translator for a small organization that would really need you and would really sort of be mutually beneficial, both in terms of giving you skills and giving them a native English speaker, smart person, graduate, university graduate, or soon to be university graduate. I I think the best way to do that would be to intense Google search, networking with colleagues, with professors, to figure out what organizations there are out there and just cold call or send them emails. And then, as Sarah was saying, it might not be your choice to have this delay in what you're doing in life, but it can be beneficial to sort of give you perspective and give you more or a different type of experience and allow you to center yourself before you figure out what you're going to do. I mean, it's not necessarily easy. I don't think there's an easy answer to this, though.
So I'll go ahead and jump in. I think it isn't easy, and I don't have all the answers. And the great thing about COVID is that we're all pretty much on the same footing when it comes to not knowing all that much at all what the future will hold. But I think one thing that I had actually wanted to maybe raise before, and incidentally related to your intervention, Ben, is being engaged globally doesn't necessarily mean you need to be out of the country. So one thing that a lot of the colleagues I work with who are still based in the US, so counterparts in other organizations or diaspora groups, are working in diaspora groups. So working in the communities where either they have language expertise or they have a particular interest. Maybe they've traveled to the region before, maybe they wanted to travel there. But I think understanding what diaspora communities in the US are doing and thinking about what's happening in that country, about US government policy related to that country, and actually thinking about the organizing and networking that can happen there is one suggestion I might have. A second suggestion in terms of staying engaged or looking for postgraduate opportunities abroad, I think the second choice I had in thinking about obstacles is moving abroad is a really big challenge, and I don't think I'd fully appreciated that. My family was, we're from Georgia. We had never really traveled much. My family is very much based in the US. And so the challenge I had was moving and actually struggling with the stress of not having status or having to wait for work status. And I'm in Switzerland. Like it's really organized and really easy. And even with that privilege, I think recognizing just how much financial uncertainty there can be and how much sort of emotional uncertainty there can be when you're applying for jobs, but even once you have one, depending on your status, yearly renewals, trying to figure out, can you leave the country at this time or not? And so I think the point I'm getting at is what you can do now to sort of set yourself up and be prepared, maybe have a little bit of a cushion, if at all possible, for any efforts you want to make to apply and seek opportunities overseas, will, I think, both be practically really important, but also kind of emotionally, it will help, I think, in making that transition of leaving the US and trying to sort of start your life over again in a new place.
And I think my co-panelists have sort of summed up my thoughts perfectly. And I would just, reiterate, do not underestimate the power of a really great informational interview. I had an informational interview with an organization about 3 years ago, and then just recently received an email about a job opportunity from that person I just had a really great conversation with. And so I feel like there are ways to, think about those global careers or the organizations doing work that really inspire you or that you're passionate about, and take this time to sort of go on LinkedIn and try to set up a conversation via Skype. Like, this is a great time to do that. It's a great time, to keep afloat by looking at the news media of topics that you're passionate about. Host a Netflix party with your friends about a human rights issue that you would like to discuss. I feel like we're all sort of adjusting to this new reality, but there are so many tools and ways that you can take advantage of this time. And if you if you're nervous about an informational interview, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to walk you through the steps and provide advice about how to go about doing that.
Thank you so much. So Jess, you just mentioned LinkedIn, and that leads us perfectly into our next question. So we'll have you start. Could you all describe some ways to use social media to promote your unique and many varied experiences for use in your career? Also, do you have any suggested groups or memberships for international conferences for career enhancement?
Sure. So, I think in the past, I have used definitely LinkedIn as a way to sort of, to connect with other organizations that I'm interested in, to sort of see the career paths of people with like-minded interests. And then I have sent out emails requesting informational interviews. And that I've been pretty successful in doing that and scheduling those meetings. I've also had a lot of other colleagues from the Ford School who scheduled informational interviews, which led then to job announcemements being sent their way, jobs that were not even posted, but they were told to apply for. So I think, social media like LinkedIn can be a really great tool to sort of do that research. I think, people are doing amazing things with Twitter these days. And I know when I was at the Ford School in particular, one of our faculty encouraged us to use Twitter in one of our class and part of our coursework. And so I feel there are movers and shakers on Twitter who are engaging in difficult conversations, who are raising awareness on, topics and issues that you might find interesting. And so, join that conversation. In some ways, your Twitter presence and social media presence could be sort of like an alternative resume showing that you're knowledgeable, that you're advocating on a particular issue. I also think, in terms of groups or memberships, for me, as a person who does work in Southeast Asian Studies, I attend the Association for Asian Studies each year. I also am a part of the American Academy for Religion. I think it's, setting time aside and sort of seeing the people in your field of interest, asking those questions as part of informational interviews. What sort of conferences, groups are you a part of? What listservs are you a part of? There's an entire listserv dedicated to Thai, Laos, and Cambodian studies, which I'm a part of, that has so many job announcements and opportunities to do work remotely, but also internationally. So I think, think about those things, reach out to people, ask questions, be persistent. That's what I would say.
Thank you. That was so helpful. I will just say that when we were organizing this event, we definitely did a Google search on all of our panelists to see what kind of web presence they had. So obviously these folks passed the test. So never underestimate the power of your web presence. Ben, I'll pass the mic to you. Anything to add?
I want to reiterate some of that, which is LinkedIn is great to see career paths of people and people who have careers you'd be interested in. But it's also really, really great to find secondary connections, sort of friends of friends who work at an organization you're interested in. And that's a really important method of finding someone to have an informational interview with, if you have some kind of connection to the person. And And then has been mentioned applying to positions, just networking, gathering information, not necessarily self-promotion, but just talking with people and letting your resume speak for itself to some extent. Also, listservs are very important. Sometimes they can be hard to find and can take just sort of Googling 7 different times, changing the wording slightly for the field or area of interest you have. DC, I mean, this is more of a DC specific one, but DC has a really big happy hour culture, which for some people is just going and having a drink to relax after work. But for most people, it's about networking and, again, hearing other people's experiences and hearing about job openings as well. And so if you have I mean, I guess it's sort of specific to DC, but isn't always. Just think of many opportunities can be networking opportunities. I guess as long as you're not too heavy-handed about it, though. Don't go over the top.
Yeah, very good. Great. So Sarah, when you are adding to this conversation, I do want to let you know that the next question seems quite targeted towards your experience. And so this audience member asked, what are some good platforms or resources for finding professional opportunities, especially in human rights and social justice fields, whether in the US or abroad? So if you could, kind of speak specifically to your industry, that would be great.
Yeah. Bad news first. I think there are incredible ways of using social media to get information, but it also does say a lot about you. And one of the things I think that many of us in human rights are particularly attuned to, especially when we work on issues that can be seen as particularly niche or particularly sensitive, your social media profile becomes something that's very hard to erase or undo or untangle from your work sort of in the current moment. So for myself, I'm reflecting on, potential next career moves and actually thinking, what is it that how can I frame my own social media profile moving forward? In what ways does it help me, but also in what ways can it maybe be a bit more of a challenge? So that's just one sort of slight caution, and also knowing where and how people network in the areas where you're hoping to land. So in DC, if it's happy hours or kickball, it's interesting to hear so much interest and focus on LinkedIn, because I think in Europe, we tend to use it very little. And a lot of the interesting things that are happening, actually a lot happen on Facebook. And so organizing protest actions, volunteer opportunities, a lot of that actually comes through Facebook, which is a little bit strange, but maybe is another way of just understanding the location-specific nature of how networking works and how information flows change. I think connected to this and sort of looking at what are the platforms for getting more exposure to human rights, being in the US is actually a really great resource, because you have so many universities, including the University of Michigan, that are well-resourced and that want to be providing opportunities to their students to interface and have conversations about some of the hardest human rights issues that we face. And so I've noticed, especially with much of the world going online, there are phenomenal lectures that would have happened, as lecture series internally to universities that are happening now in a remote setting. That gives the organizers a lot more ability to bring in exactly the experts that they want and to have a really robust conversation. But it also means that those events are accessible to a much broader audience. In particular, I noticed that Columbia, NYU, Yale have some really strong lecture series that they've been putting up. And they're also traditionally universities that have very strong and very engaged human rights programs, especially kind of internationally. So I think that's maybe one way of thinking about following social media to get that information, also keeping track of what human human rights centers or research institutes are doing at universities, and how suddenly a lot of that is becoming more accessible because it's being moved online. And then using those as opportunities to follow up with speakers, to follow up with the faculty or the staff of those institutes, and to follow up also on the issues or the organizations that the speakers represent.
Thank you so much. Okay, so our next question says, I wonder if any of the panelists have experienced changing job sector to one that might not have been closely related with your previous experience. For example, going from the private to public sector or from for-profit to nonprofit. So the question is, how do you leverage your skills to match with the employer's requirements? I love this question because it talks about, the transferability of skills, and it doesn't even have to, in my experience, wouldn't even have to require a changing of sector, but, just I would love to hear maybe some examples of how each of you have leveraged skills that might not have been obvious to a job change. So I will call on Jess.
That's a really great question. I haven't necessarily experienced, changing a job sector per se. Like I've always been mainly working in the nonprofit realm. I would say when I was in graduate school, I basically worked as a research consultant for a nonprofit based in San Francisco that worked on human trafficking prevention globally. And ultimately, why I was hired, for the position compared to other candidates was because I had, I had a deep knowledge of Southeast Asia. So specifically, they were looking to send me to Thailand and Laos and Cambodia. And so I had sort of the area studies training. I had the cultural awareness. I had previously worked there, and the language skills. And so in addition to being able to do the research, I think they saw sort of my area studies mindset, my international training mindset, as an advantage to sort of do more thorough research, do more well-rounded research to add, an understanding of the cultural elements and how that, may affect human trafficking prevention or support human trafficking prevention organizations operating in Southeast Asia. So I think there's so many ways in taking the skill sets that you've learned at University of Michigan, whether that's your writing skills, language skills, quantitative or qualitative research skill sets. So many employers are looking for, I think, what either Sarah or Laura mentioned, somebody who can just, engage in compelling communication, somebody who can write quickly, somebody who can write an email professionally. Those are things that are essential, I feel like, in any job, and that you can use no matter what sector that you're in. So those are my thoughts for this specific question.
Thank you so much. Sarah, would you like to add?
Yeah, just briefly. So I had the experience of changing from public sector to nonprofit sector. And I spoke a little bit about that earlier. But I think what was really interesting about that is that the kind of job I was doing in many ways was very similar. So the kind of emphasis on policy analysis, on diplomacy, on negotiating that I had in the State Department. So while I was a PMF, I did a lot of work on trade negotiations and trade preference programs. So that's a lot of negotiating internal to the US government, because you have state, you have the Department of Labor, you have the Trade Representative's Office, and everybody has a slightly different view on some of these questions. But also I worked for the US mission in Geneva as a negotiator on the diplomatic side. So although I changed sectors and although the sort of structures in which I was working with were very different, that element of the work was incredibly relevant. I just happened to be on the other side of the table now. So obviously from the perspective of an employer in the nonprofit sector, understanding how a government, and especially the US government, given how big and how influential it is, how that government works, what are some of the considerations, what is the language that they use. It's very useful in general, and in diplomacy, it was particularly useful. What I would say though was maybe the surprise and the needing to leverage skills is that was quite an easy transition. I mean, it took a lot of intentional putting one hat on, taking a hat off. But a lot of the skills that I found myself now needing to have, I actually didn't have at all. So things like grant writing, budgeting, management skills, communication skills, being comfortable on Twitter. Those are things that in the State Department were never going to be parts of my job description, were never really things that I would have learned or invested in. And I found that having to start a job where about half of the time I felt totally confident and really sure that, the skills had transferred, and half of the time I was really learning on my toes, was a big challenge. And I think in changing sector, especially when there's a difference in size and sort of comparative responsibility, US government, as I said, you're one cog in a very, very big machine. In a small NGO, you do a little bit of everything. And so I think that maybe more so than the sector difference, the context of work difference was really striking for me.
Thank you so much. Ben, would you like to speak to your experience?
Sure. So I just transitioned from semi-for-profit development to the public sector federal government, and have been pleasantly surprised with the amount of similarities in grants and contractual mechanisms, and how I can use similar budgeting and tracking skills and project management. And that, I guess I shouldn't have been as surprised as I'm not super surprised, but I shouldn't be surprised at all, I guess. What I would recommend to people is just general, regular self-reflection, keeping track of your duties and responsibilities and accomplishments, like using your job description as a base, either from the official job description you have or whatever was in the advertisement you responded to that you got your job, or just have a running list generally, and then build on that from what you do on a day-to-day basis and things you're proud of. And so track these, step back, and realistically assess what fits with the career you're trying to jump into, and see what's a good fit, what's flexible and related and could be semi-transferable, and be honest about it, and be honest about what doesn't fit also. You wouldn't want to be stuck in a job where you don't have all of the sort of tools in your tool chest to work on it, and people will appreciate the honesty as well.
Thank you so much. So the next question, I actually submitted myself, and so I thought if you could indulge me for just a moment. I think about this a lot on my own career trajectory. Just how do we define success? Are we there yet? When will we get there? And so I wanted to ask each of you, what are some of the common misconceptions about being successful in today's professional climate? Or just, more broadly, what are some common misconceptions people might have about your field? Sarah, would you like to start us on this one?
So this is an excellent question, and one that I was thinking quite a bit about in reading through and preparing. So I've got a number of answers, but I think I'll just pick one. I think one of the challenges and maybe misconceptions that people have about working on human rights is that it's your life, that, you know, you sort of have to, you'll hear people talk about sort of being a martyr to human rights work, that it is both your passion and your life and your job. And there's a lot of debate and discussion within the human rights movement about what that means, what assumptions underpin that kind of a misconception or preconception. And I think it applies more globally beyond just the human rights field. But the idea that if it's something that is a cause that you're working for, that you think is worth fighting for, that you'll, you know, go to any length to get the work done. And what I find are the people that are the most successful and particularly the most sustainable in human rights jobs, the people who I look up to and have positions that I would like, they draw really firm boundaries around work and non-work, and they know when to stop. And I think there's a really growing body of knowledge in general, in terms of sort of professional development and success and leadership, but especially within the human rights community around the value of well-being, and taking time out, and being able to say, you know, it is healthier for me, and it is therefore healthier for my job and the people that I work with and the objectives that we have, to stop now. I don't need to work until midnight. I don't need to be on every conference call. I don't need to work through the weekend. Sometimes, very rarely, yes. But a lot of the time, I think it's to me, I think especially sort of getting a little bit older and moving into kind of a middle management stage, it's really something I also try to emulate, because I'm aware that people who are junior, who are working, reporting to me, or who are seeing me in the way that I work, I'm setting an example for them. And I think being more confident about the value of saying, we think that it's important to work, you know, 150% of the time, because we care about what we do, but sometimes caring about what we do means we need to know when to stop, and when it's no longer sustainable and healthy for anyone. So.
Thank you so much. Ben.
So this is a pretty good question. I think also pretty tricky, pretty subjective and different by person. And I really do agree with what Sarah said and a number of other things we've touched on, that it is important to have a work-life balance, and finding something that you're interested in that motivates you. And I mean, I think that in many cases would be success enough, having that. But don't discount other things that may be important to you, such as the size of the organization, if it's for profit, not for profit, the work culture, the commute. One big tip, I think, is if and when you're doing informational interviews, is to ask people what the work culture is like, because it really, I don't know, I guess it's not a super duper common question. It comes up pretty often, but not all the time. And lets people sort of freeform, and you can learn a lot about what they do and don't like about the organization generally, and you can sort of see what matches with you. I guess again, yeah, it's still success is still pretty subjective. You don't need to let other people define it for you, is another big thing. But that's sort of another more of a philosophical question. But yeah, thank you. Good question.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate that final comment about not letting others define. Very reassuring. Jess, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was thinking about this question and preparing, I also just came to the question of work-life balance. And I think particularly in higher education, you work around amazingly smart, individuals who don't have a 9-to-5 schedule. But also as an undergraduate student and a graduate student, your time and your class schedule, is very different from working 9-to-5. And so you are working different hours throughout the day. And not, sometimes you're putting in more than 40 hours a week. And so I think, as somebody who came from U of M, definitely struggled with having a work-life balance. And now I work at U of M and I work in higher education. This has been very, an important topic for me and how to navigate. And I think it sort of, as Sarah mentioned, it's learning how to set boundaries professionally, and setting boundaries often can be uncomfortable. And so I think no matter what field you're in, work culture, determining what's important for you, what you need to do to engage in work-life balance, but also engaging in self-care and emotional health and wellness. And I think for me, that has really been learning how to negotiate and have difficult conversations, not in a pejorative way, but just sort of learning how to set boundaries professionally when it comes to work planning, when it comes to, working on the weekend. And so I think that is really an essential skill that I've learned over time, and sort of communicating with my colleagues and managers and other stakeholders that I work with. And I've definitely, I've been in a position where I've been burnt out. And I think I've had to learn how to set aside my perfectionist ways and realize that when you engage in good quality work, it's sort of learning how to table projects and come back to them with new perspective and having space. And so with not every work culture will allow you to do that. But I think it's sort of that self-reflection piece that Ben was mentioning, learning self-reflection skills and how to employ that in the work that you're doing can really help you to succeed.
Thank you all so much. That was incredibly insightful. So we are approaching the end of the event, and I want to acknowledge that there are 2 other questions on here that are fairly specific about working for the UN and applying to Fulbrights. And I just want to let you know that I would be happy to point the question askers or anyone else in the audience to very targeted, specific resources for the answers to those questions. I do want to mention that we will be posting the recording of this session on the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies YouTube, and likely the other contributing co-sponsor YouTubes if they consent. So definitely check out the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies YouTube channel in the next few days. You can get that information from the International Institute's website. And then we will also point you to the contact information for our panelists so that you can get in contact with them for any additional follow-up questions. I do want to end just very quickly on a positive note. I want to ask each of our presenters to name their very favorite thing about their job, and then we will call it an afternoon. So Ben, would you please start us off with very favorite thing?
Working with nice people is pretty good. I thought I wouldn't enjoy, but I do enjoy. We have a daily call-in every morning now that we're all working remotely, and it's nice to hear everyone's voices even though we can't see each other. The other thing is, I guess, the general mission. Like, democracy is a pretty important thing. I'm really happy to be working in that field of promoting access to the ballot. So it's good to sort of step back and look at that every now and then.
Thank you. Jess?
Sure. So I think one of the favorite aspects of my job is sort of the public scholarship that I'm able to engage in. So one of the grant projects I support is a year-long fellowship program for K through 12 teachers to learn about the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And so this was a project that my coworker and I came up with, and we wrote it into the grant and it got funded. And so it's been really rewarding to sort of have a vision for something and to be able to execute it and then see how people in the state of Michigan are being able to take advantage of it. So we have teachers who come to the University of Michigan once a month for a workshop, and we engage in a lot of religious literacy, cultural awareness, so that they can better support Michigan primary and secondary students. And so it's interesting, speaking to our earlier conversation about this thread that exists throughout your career, I can see that sort of emerging with this project as well. But it's a lot of fun and it's really rewarding. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And Sarah, final comments.
So a couple of answers to this one. I mean, one of the things that I think I really appreciate about my job, and that's actually also been something I've learned about what I need from a job, is I couldn't tell you, what a regular day is like. There's an incredible amount of diversity in terms of who I'm speaking with, what we're doing, the different kinds of activities and skills that I need to use. And I think that that's really exciting because it means each day is sort of like a slightly different job. A second thing that I think is, really something that I value and one of my favorite things about the job is this moment, and I think the fellow panelists will understand what I'm talking about, a few years into a position where people start coming to you and recognizing that because you've been present, because you've built up a relationship, because you've built up a reputation, that you start to be a go-to person on the things that you work on. And that might just be within your organization. It might be much broader. I got invited to speak on a panel and to write a book chapter just because, over time, I've been able to sort of cultivate both a network and a really strong sort of grounding in being trusted and being seen as competent and professional in what I do. And so that's a really exciting moment to sort of hit in a job. And I think it holds true for everybody. So that I really like. And then finally, I get to meet some really amazing activists who have heartbreaking stories, but who are also still really trying to do their best to make their societies better.
Thank you all so much. What a wonderful way to close out the panel. So we've gotten a few questions. How can I get in contact with the panelists? Like I said, we're going to post the recording on the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies YouTube channel. At that time, I will provide contact information, whether it's through our center or directly with the panelists, depending on each panelist's preference. In the meantime, if you would like to contact the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, please email lacs.office@umich.edu. So lacs.office@umich.edu, and I'll be happy to direct your questions accordingly. So I just want to thank Jesse Miller. He was the only one that didn't pop up on your screen today, but he's been behind the scenes the whole time, just handling all of the logistics, the technology that allowed this to happen. Thank you so much to our panelists, all of our co-sponsors and the International Institute, and to our engaged audience. It was really wonderful to see so many of you participating and asking questions. With all of that said, I'm just so happy that this happened. It was a little bit of a logistical challenge to pull it together with so many pieces up in the air, but thank you all again. Please stay safe, stay well. It was a pleasure to speak with you all virtually today, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.